Hi guys, welcome to round 5 of UADC 2017. In government, we have NUS1. In opposition, we have IBA-DU 1. I'm the single chair as well. My name is Nuzal. Omni Mara. Motion for the House is as a teacher from underprivileged minority group. This House would inflate grades by people from similar units and other groups, right? First minute, what's it, 6, what's it, 7, 10 minutes, so on and so forth. Right, if there are any questions that calls us to order, we can invite the Honorable Prime Minister to there's no national preferential pronoun, government, no, not pronouns. Okay. Alright, let's begin.
Jodoh Bangladesh? Okay, let's do this. Education is oppressive to minorities like blacks, like migrants, like gays and lesbians. When state schools have little money to fund programs, when the language of English that you're marked in hurts every other subject's proficiency like math and science, when children are beaten down day after day, seeing the white man do better and facing some very racist teachers in their school, it's small wonder that children give up. The outcome, therefore, is that they likely drop out of schools and their lives and their future selves are closed off to the vagaries of fate. As a teacher from an underprivileged race who have made it to join Teach for America or Teach for the UK, we say your overarching duty in this case is not to the profession's honesty, but to help the children make it too. And we think that raising their grades in the face of an oppressive system is the only directly effective solution to do so. I will speak slowly and not make the mistake in the earlier round, Mr. Speaker. I just want to go through a policy model first, and then 2 substantive arguments. 1, why your duty to the race is more important than your duty to the teaching profession, and number 2, the probabilistically likely better outcomes. Number 1, on the policy. So first I have to explain how students are marked, just in case you're not on the same page, right? So like you have multiple choice questions where there's clearly a right or wrong answer. We can't tamper with that, that's just stupid. But for essays, for mathematics workings where you have to carry forward the error, or even for like oral presentations like this one I'm debating right now, there's often a discretionary banded marking range where people can get excellency to 76 to 77, so on and so forth. What we say is that we will raise the band for a student by about 1 or 2 bands for any underprivileged race, not just the one that you're from. Okay, so like for example, if a student gets a B, we give him an A-, for example, etc. We won't raise a D to an A because 1, that's really stupid, and number 2, like that's just going to get you caught, which is stupid. We also do think that because of raising for any race in the school, it is harder to figure out that you're doing this deliberately. Now, so what we say is that the principle is, because schools already do moderation, which is subjective inherently across subjects, and there are some subjects like English, for example, or music or mathematics, where marking is actually fairly subjective, we do think that this passes the penumbra of plausible deniability, so that the outcome is that more of these students pass or get Latin honors. We would also like to clarify that this is not mutually exclusive with other measures like after-school tuition, but oftentimes these other prophylactic measures are not targeted to the race's particular needs, and the child may have dropped out of school beforehand, which is kind of bad, right? So, what if we get found out? So, number 1, we think it's unlikely because of all the plausible arguments we gave you earlier, that like this is within what's already practiced. But secondly, even if you are found out somehow, that it's too late because this is reactive, and the kids that you marked up will already be in the system, probably better in high school. So at least 1 or 2 classrooms or years of people who already get to benefit. Furthermore, we also advance that schools are also unlikely to fire you because you're a minority teacher. It just looks really bad PR to fire a minority teacher, like no one ever does that. Okay, 2 substantive arguments. I will keep slowing down. Number 1, why the duties to your race are more important than that to the teaching profession. Now, we acknowledge that obviously people have competing moral frames, like you want to be an honest person, you also want to help your race, right? But the reason as to why we think you should favor helping your race and becoming dishonest in this instance are for 4 reasons. Number 1, because education is oppressive, and the impact on this argument is that the longer you continue to be complicit in this oppressive system, forcing people and giving them handouts because they cannot fulfill a standard which is inhuman, it is morally making you culpable in this kind of oppression. Secondly, and this is critical, listen to this, integrity is not an a priori good. We only value truth and honesty because it happens to get us the most instrumental outcomes in society. However, when the outcome of our children who don't do as well, when they drop out because they feel hopeless that they cannot succeed in this world, and they close off the possibilities of their future self, a moral agent who also deserves as much consideration, we think integrity can therefore be sacrificed in this case. Yes, Rona?
Do you think you're doing a service to these kids by hiding their incompetency, by marking them higher in areas where they obviously don't deserve those work?
Absolutely, we think we're doing them a great service. Second substantive, promise I'll get to it, right? The third thing is that we argue that you're also not being a bad teacher because there's something called the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, something that, we all teach our first year like debate coaching kids. So the idea is that as a teacher, you're also about a caretaker of lives. And are you moral if you up their grades? Maybe not, but you're a moral person when you engineer circumstances to give them a better life. So just as much as you're a teacher, you're also a person and you have that duty. But speaking particularly to impact on race, you as a teacher have often struggled against the odds of that race. You probably benefited from scholarships or when your father gave you additional savings to go to school. Moral reciprocity therefore compels you to give back. A thought experiment that proves this is, for example, while society places a premium on good Samaritan behavior for you to help people in need, even if you've never seen them before or you're not of the same race, we just generally place a value on us being part of a collective society larger than ourselves. Second substantive, where I give Ronald's argument. What are the likely outcomes? And Mr. Speaker, you find this very familiar. I want to take you to the mind of a hijabi girl in a poor state school in, let's say, Malaysia, who he turned to before this, hasn't done well in English, and suddenly gets a B+, and the teacher says, well done, you've done very well. What goes through her mind? Three things. Oh my God, I'm as good as the Chinese majority in this case. And the power of hope for a young child who has not known any better alternative, who has not heard any better counter-narrative at home, telling people to just give up and stay home, they now hope to aspire to better. Especially powerful for women in this case. Women who are often told to stay home because all they're good for is making babies and keeping the home because that is your role in life, and that's an example. Like, we also think the power of a placebo effect, especially for children who are full of potential, and when they're told they can do something, they often become better at something. Just like how when we first got our first 18 months in debate, we are like, we can do this shit. Like, we should stay in debate. And the outcome, therefore, Mr. Speaker, is that these kids often don't drop out of school. They continue in high school. They continue the counterfactual exercise that they drop out. And when the grades are better on average, this means that when they go to high school, like, clearly, if it's too tough in high school and they drop out, at least they drop out at a later stage to get more education. But likely, universities will keep them in for reasons. Because number one, universities already tend to hire on considerations of diversity anyway. So meritocracy is not absolutely essential at the university level. See the number of black scholarships that are given out at state universities in America. Also, universities which are privately funded tend to have more academic support and networks, which means that by the time they get there and are out of the underfunded public school system, they've got more money to actually do well. And they can also, specialize, Like, for example, Shirley is really bad at math, but she's a goddess at lit and she saves her ass on the culture rounds. This means that she is able to specialize and become really good and become a subject matter expert and leading light in the community. And the reason why this is important are for two additional reasons. Number one, now you have more people of the minorities in society. You normalize the perception that they can succeed. Even if you take middle-level jobs at McDonald's or managers, you just see more of them in successful positions. You normalize the perception that people can do better, can get better outcomes in life. All this for a little dishonesty, we think is a very fair trade-off.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I now invite the leader of the opposition.
I think it's a massive exaggeration to say one grade in one course from a member of your own community is going to inspire you to fight in a situation that is as dire as they paint it to be. I think it's also a massive exaggeration to say these people don't have opportunities at all and have no success stories. The mere existence of a teacher that got there fairly by fighting hard and fighting the oppression shows that there are ways in which you can succeed even if you're disadvantaged as that community. And we'll show to you the pathway to success for these communities in my speech. But we think that at a point in time, when success otherwise is one untainted with ethics, or two is more likely to happen, at that point in time, you sacrificing your morals is an invaluable trade-off that we're not willing to make. The first thing they tell us is, like, understand that these people are more tied to their race than their profession. No, firstly, the ability of a teacher to consent to serving the greater society was one that this teacher opted into. So the moment she signed the contract that said, I'm going to serve society at large, she stopped being a member of her community, but a member of society and to serve it. So firstly, on a basic level, we don't think her responsibility is clearly just to her community. She's doing a disservice to her primary motive and something she consented into. Second, we think even if her loyalties are to her community, she's doing a disservice to the students of her community as well. Firstly, because you're letting them down on the one place they wanted fairness. If the rest of the world is unfair to these children, the one thing that that child expects from a member of his own community is to be fair, treat him like a normal person, and recognize and tell him about the needs that he has and help him develop through those needs, rather than giving him a false reality of where he is and telling them he's better than he actually is. That's first. But second, you put him in a bubble that says that his bad grades are not due to his incompetence, but due to the biases of other teachers. So he always expects a bigger brother to look after him versus actually trying to improve himself in the long run by tackling that oppression, because he believes that biases are the only thing blaming him. But thirdly, if oppression is a principle that's immoral, you being oppressive to the majority that oppressed you means you're in principle no different to them when it comes to fairness. We never saw a justification from team proposition as to why they're doing the same thing to us and we reciprocating is a moral act on our favor because we're being them. That's a principal engagement in this debate that they failed to highlight. But we think this debate is far bigger. It's about the impacts and in general how these children are benefited in the long run. Before that, Chair Pure.
Yeah, so if the majority is already doing this systems and oppressive, why should you not resist?
Because you are resisting by fighting against it and making a successful story out of it versus unfairly reaching a point in time, which we'll just show you. I promise I'll get there as well. So firstly, we think the first impact of this is less effort from the teacher in general. What does this effort look like? You don't equip children to face what the real world looks like, i.e. fight against biases and stand up to them. You tell them that it's okay to be in safe spaces and they're actually better than they are, and the fact that there aren't biases in the long run. This creates two problems. First, the child is put in a false reality where he expects support at all phases of life. But second, here's the biggest problem. You remove effort on the part of the teacher to solve structural issues that may affect this child in other situations. What are these structural flaws? Things like the education curriculum, things that systematically disadvantage this child and don't bring him into the limelight. Things like more incorporation of these children into the fold and treating them fairly. This teacher no longer has an incentive to tackle all other teachers that are being unfair because she can still get this guy the grades he wants and have no reason to do so. So less effort from this teacher in other issues is particularly detrimental for this community to solve the biggest issues that are structural forms of subtle oppression that these communities face. We think that's a trade-off that is never worth it. Second, in terms of the probability of the majority finding out of whether or not this has happened, the one thing they tell us is, look, it's probably going to be subjective marking that is going to be accepted. Two responses. First, when a member of an oppressed community gets to a position of teacher, the point that a teacher is a position of authority. So when you already have an oppressed minority in a position of authority, they're continuously scrutinized for being there because you think they don't deserve to be there. So that level of scrutiny is at every scale. So it's going to be far more minute than normal version of scrutiny that they expect. Secondly, it's actually quite evident because even in subjective subjects, the amount of effort children put in, the amount of it's probably easy to assume that two people wrote similar things but got distinctly different marks, ladies and gentlemen. At that point in time, a child, here's the crucial characterization, a child who cares to compete but only cares about fairness, in most cases, is likely to resent the fact that this has happened. Why so? Because at that mental state, the child no longer thinks about the rest of society and how oppressive the society has been to this minority. He cares about his small grades, and even the slightest tinge of like changes makes any competitive child unlikely to be open to interacting with these minority children. What does this mean? This means that you, for the first time ever, give them a reason to hate the minority. Before, the random hate was for no reason at all. Right now, there is a reason for it because they're being structurally oppressed by that community in general. This means interactions become hostile when they otherwise could have been meaningful. Second, you never make meaningful connections and become friends. So it's very hard for a child's mentality to grasp the true essence of oppression. He takes it even harder. Thirdly, we think biases can be tackled in other ways as well. Like, if other teachers are being unfair, you as students realize that this kid, if he's competent in getting fair grades in one subject, probably deserves fair grades in other subjects as well. The problem is when these majority children start resenting you for the unfair marks you're getting in one subject, they're less likely to like go out for you or be your friend in other subjects as well, where you probably deserve that mark as well. We think that's harmful. But lastly, what's the pathway to development for this community? It's usually individuals, because there are always some individuals from within this community that can compete, that can get up there, be leaders, succeed, put in the hard work, and get to the top. The problem is their legacy is never tainted in our world because it's only with hard work and ethic that they get there. They eventually come back to their own community, invest, help them out, and are seen as role models and leaders. The problem in proposition's world is every single leader that's created from that community is one whose legacy is tainted as being an unfair leader, as one who never deserved to be there. So every time they come to help, that won't be proper help. We think we need to solve these problems for these children. The best way to do that is to be fair to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The leader of opposition, we invite the different parties.
So I don't have a fancy opening because I'm going to save the diatribe for some time later in my speech. I'm going to clarify one thing before I move on to rebuttal. So they say it's only one grade by one teacher. I'm just like, so if you're trying to diminish the impact of this motion in this case by suggesting that it's only one isolated instance, then all your arguments about the increased resentment against children and on increased discrimination against black teachers and black students in society will also be similarly diminished, right? It will just be a case of one errant teacher who went crazy. But we think that the motion has a bit more impact than this. That we want to generalize the idea that even a single teacher can influence the grades and the lives of several years worth of students who will then go on to do great things in their lives, and that if even a few hundred teachers a year had this sort of mentality, let alone thousands of teachers in a huge country like the United States, we would actually be able to make a positive difference. Rebuttal. First, and I think this is the most important idea in the debate, right? That somehow you're going to get caught. Because if you're going to get caught, then a lot of the benefits presumably are going to be obviated. I've got several responses to this. So firstly, we're not going to tell the kids that we are upping his grades artificially. We don't tell the kids when we moderate their grades artificially either, even in normal circumstances, right? We just say, yeah, sometimes they tell you there's been a moderation exercise. Sometimes they don't even tell you there's been a moderation exercise. You just get your final grades after you go through your A-levels and you don't even know how the Cambridge markers mark your papers in the first place. And like, oh, I got an A. Surprise! I was getting straight S's before A-levels and I got 7 A's at the end. I don't know how. Hopefully not. But you get what I'm trying to say, right? The point is nobody will find out. Secondly, obviously we won't cheat, we could adjust your grades infinitesimally for an individual assignment, but chances are we probably will adjust your grades on an overall basis, right? After the end of the semester, so that you don't see the individual discrepancies at the start. More importantly, we think that it is very unlikely you'll get caught because teachers have been more blatant about cheating or giving preferential treatment to girls to give them low jobs, or just simply teachers' pets for years and not get caught, right? It is an accepted phenomenon in most schools, primarily because there are many high schools or middle schools or elementary schools out there. There are very few inspectors to go around. Many of these schools are in rural areas. It is just logistically impossible to check with these teachers regularly over a long period of time. So all the same problems with regulating teachers in general allows you the same cover in order to perpetrate this policy. Thank you. We also don't think that you're going to lull kids into a sense of complacency or allow the kids into a false reality, right? So because by your logic, given the fact that there's only one grade by one teacher anyway, like it is highly unlikely that you are going to put them into a sense of false reality. The bare naked truth in their homes, in their neighborhoods where they are ridden by drug lords and gang members, or even in school where often black kids are discriminated even if you have that one teacher on your side, it's significant. You're not going to make them live in a false reality. They know perfectly well what that reality is like. The difference is that you have that one or two teachers who are rooting for you, right? So even if they don't know you're adjusting the grades for them, they know that you are rooting for them and you're giving them advice and guidance, and they see that reflected in their improvement on the grades. And that is important, right? It is important in giving them hope in order for them to keep fighting for that place in high school that has a higher cutoff point, and so that this compounds itself over time, right? So that's the main test. So I've proven at the end of this first point of rebuttal that as long as I disprove the notion that you will get caught, then all your problems just fall to the wayside. But even if you do get caught, how do you trace the legacy of many hundreds of students who have gone by you in your years or decades as a teacher? And given the fact that you're only one teacher among many teachers involved in the system or involved in the upbringing of a single child, I don't think it's very easy, even if you get caught, to trace your effect upon the kids themselves, which means maybe you take the hit to your reputation and your jail time, but I don't think the kids are going to be significantly harmed in any way. So all the benefits, all the harm that you talk about resentment, about lack of credibility and what have you, probably fall to the wayside as well. But I want to talk about the second area of rebuttal, right, which I think is also equally important. And this is about morality, because I don't think morality ought to be an issue in this debate. They say, you become a teacher, therefore have a responsibility to society. I'm like, balls, you are a soldier. You have the right to be a conscientious objector or to disobey unlawful orders. You cannot just say, I told them become a commander. I told the innocent civilians because my commander told me to. That is nonsense. So don't tell me that just because you joined a freaking profession, somehow you subscribe to a different code of ethics. We have to see things in broader perspective. So where does the moral debate therefore lie? We think there is a greater obligation. First, Lucas told you that you suffer from a birth lottery. I'm going to expand on this. If a black family is the victim of a police shooting, racism by being evicted because your landlord doesn't like black neighbors, or your other tenants don't like black neighbors, so the landlord has kicked you out, or you are refused, you are discriminated against in your job applications, this is a huge impact on the black kid's ability to grow up without having to worry about financial stability, to be able to hire babysitters so that you don't become unsupervised after school and drop out, druggies or gang members, and then drop out of school or do worse in school. So this sense of this part of the birth lottery is important, right? Secondly, we think that people receive discrimination on the part of teachers for various reasons in the past as well, especially with regard to your racial background, right? So we are merely correcting for discrimination that you probably have experienced at the hands of other teachers in the past in the very same subject or in other subjects. Furthermore, we talk about discrimination in entry-level jobs or in admissions processes, right? Maybe the private universities are less, in fact, practice affirmative action with regard to admission of minority candidates. But this is not true for many high schools. This is not true for many other applications. This is not true, especially for job admissions, wherein no such affirmative action requirement exists. And at the point in time in which the difference between you who get the job and the other guy who didn't get a job is potentially half a grade or a third of a grade, this is a significant difference. So for all three systemic reasons, I've told you why life is systemically unfair, and therefore why there is no moral obligation for you to play by the rules. In fact, by this logic, given the fact that the system is so utterly unmeritocratic despite preaching meritocracy, you might have an obligation to do our policy if you care about meritocracy in general, as opposed to the uplifting of minorities. Because if we reward the wrong sort of people for those who are privileged and at the expense of those who are disprivileged, you're not actually practicing meritocracy at all. You are merely rewarding privilege. And that is a knock-on effect if you care so much for your teacher's duty to ensure that the best people get the best jobs and so on and so forth, right? So clearly, even by those moral rules, you ought to favor our side as well. So what have I told you at the end? I've told you that the principal premise by which all of the harms accrue, the idea that you'll somehow get caught, is not going to happen. Or even if it is, the effects are going to be significantly less severe than we thought. I've then proven to you that morality is also not part of this debate in the sense that The morality figures outside, and even if it doesn't, I think it matters more about how you achieve your moral aims as opposed to the moral aims themselves. And given that Lucas has already talked to you about the knock-on effects of such a policy, we think we take this debate.
Thank you very much. If I understand, we need a opposition.
I don't know the time. So I think the fundamental question that we start this debate with is, how does a teacher best impact the life of these children? They would like to assume that it's that affirmation that these kids require that is the crux of the teacher's responsibility. But if it is indeed the crux of the teacher's responsibility to show them the better way out, we would argue, and we have argued time and time again, that the teacher does a massive disservice by hiding the incompetency of this individual. No matter how the PM and the DPM would like to disengage with this idea, what does adjustment really look like? Adjustment looks like hiding your flaws of articulation. Adjustment looks like the fact that you haven't done as much as your other peers in class, but you still end up with a better grade, which means no matter how you put it, you are not as capable as someone else who would have otherwise plausibly deserved that grade, or you would have been naturally inclined to give that individual an A or a B+. So it's a natural disservice that you're hiding the flaw of that individual. You're telling them that they're competent, you're telling them that they're okay, that they're on par, where they're clearly not. So you are shying away from your core responsibility as a teacher to protect that vulnerable individual by telling them that you need to work harder. That I recognize that the system is perhaps stacked against you, but that is absolutely no reason for you to give up like this or simply think that the system is going to be forever stacked against you and you're never going to be able to change it. The way to change it is to put in that hard work, which is the core responsibility that the teacher shies away from, which we think is incredibly bad. But they further tell us that teachers can be better latched onto students and tell them to stay away from drugs and be that guiding influence in their lives. We think that can happen in our world too. That isn't necessarily contingent on giving them a better grade. In fact, if you aren't that hard-ass teacher who tells that person for what he really is, the facts, the personality traits that he needs to develop, or the kind of competencies that he requires to have by the time that he ends up graduating school or college, you're doing that disservice that we talked about. So it's more important for the teacher to, yes, be a guiding influence and be that individual who tells you what to do, but at the same time, not shy away from the core responsibilities of what is right and what is not right. But understand this, when do students actually drop out? If you think that these individuals are permanently dissatisfied by the education system, we don't think changing one grade massively changes their perception of ever dropping out. But all the harms in our world still exist. However, what does indeed prevent them from dropping out? When the education curriculum changes, when conversations about engaging these students in class takes the front seat, when you actually make an attempt to tell these students that, look, I'm not going to give you a grade simply because you're in my class, but I'm going to make you work for that affirmative action scholarship, which is going to get you a better place in college. I'm going to push you to your limits to achieve what you really have. Those are the kind of things that are important, and those are the conversations that take a backseat when that teacher, who's probably the only one in that position to fight the rest of authority, now thinks that he or she is getting his job done by merely giving better credits to its students, whereas obviously they don't deserve it. We think that that's an important distinction in responsibility, which separates a good teacher from the bad. We think it's incredibly important that you protect it. But understand this, that they're so inclined to believe that these individuals will never be found out. We've told you how peers have a way of detecting that certain students are placing in less effort but still getting better grades. And the conclusion is not only that they start disliking the teacher, we would still argue that disliking the teacher would be equivalent to disliking that community, because now they think that that entire community is ganging up as a means of exacting revenge on the majority, which significantly hurts the classroom cooperation between these two racial classes, which we think is problematic in the first place. But at the point at which these students try and start identifying the fact that their peers are getting better grades in one subject, reduces their intention to help them out in other subjects where they would require more help. So these students who could have been your peers and your classroom coordinators, who could have fought that inequality in class for you as your partners, reduce that incentive because they see that the teachers are unfairly helping and unfairly strategizing to give them better grades anyway. So that collective political capital within the student body to try and create changes within the classroom, to try and point out when other teachers are being blatantly discriminatory towards certain individuals, constantly reduces, because that resentment builds, and that is something that significantly wedges the gap between the relationships that they could have otherwise had. Yes.
A lot of the time, the reason why the students do worse is because marking schemes don't actually take into account the way a minority views the world, therefore they are because they feel legitimate. Why is it then that that can't be a conversation started if we needed to talk about why the systemic is
unfairly rectifying those marks simply takes away more time that could have been allotted to the conversation that the grading system in fact needs to be sensitive, needs to be culturally and racially sensitive. The more that you give them better grades, the more that you cover up a significant flaw in the system, which is the very reason that these kids don't get better grades in the first place. If you think that the flaw in the system is so vital, let's place more effort to fight that flaw rather than trying to find out other ways of rectifying it. We think that's a huge, huge issue. But at the end of the day, let's understand this. I think as teachers, you have a responsibility to prepare them for the world at large and not just give them that false hope. That is something that Sajid told you, to no response from the opposition. You have to give them that actual teaching, and you can't put them in a bubble, making them believe that the world is always going to be out there to protect you. You need to be able to make these individuals, make these students understand that there aren't going to be people who are like-minded, there aren't going to be people who are going to be protecting you in job interviews and whatnot. You are going to be out there looking out for yourself. And that responsibility is one which is better maintained by a teacher when he gives them fair grades, which is directly equivalent to counting as many flaws as my students have. You know, in a nice and sympathetic tone. We can be achieved simultaneously. Not necessarily you can apply this which we say one to do all of it. These are stuff can be overcome. Because there are other studies like succeeding in a basis like me, absolute teaching. I have access to myself. Those are the kind of role models that work out experience.
A lot of what opposition says is a description of status quo, where currently minority teachers don't inflate the grades of these other minorities that go to their school. And the effects that we see higher dropout rates for these individuals and lower university entrances for these individuals as well. What they failed to demonstrate was why exactly there was going to be an overwhelming harm from the inflation of these grades, such that it would detract from a situation in which very little progress has already been made in society. I'm going to talk about this debate on two levels. Firstly, we're going to talk about the principle of what the teacher wants to do, and after we're going to talk about the pathway to success and compare the two strategies. I think the first thing they want to note about principles is a couple of responses that they had. The first thing they told us was that you are now the oppressor, and that makes you no different from the people who have been oppressing you. Like, no, oppression is systemic discrimination against individuals that disallow them from being able to access opportunities in life. Like, I think that the individual action of one teacher cannot match up the kind of structural oppression that minorities face. But also, I think that this idea that somehow you are taking away from another individual who worked harder than the minority that you speak of is a lie. Because I think Adil spent a lot of time in his speech explaining why is it that students who come from disadvantaged communities oftentimes face more barriers than a normal, like, privileged student or a majority student in being able to get good marks. Which is to say that if you look at effort, not just as effort in studying, but a quantitative effort of the accumulation of difficulties they to get through. Like, for example, like coming from a poorer socioeconomic class, like, for example, being in worse schools, for instance. We think that this idea of effort is something that minority students do provide as well. But the third thing that they told us was that you have opted to serve the community, and as a result, you now owe the community or society a duty. I don't think that's true. One, teaching is just a job. To the extent to which you choose to become a fireman doesn't mean that you give up your life like crazily in order to save someone from fire, etc. But secondly, if you understand that the teachers from these minority communities are few and far between, then I think what you also need to recognize is that these are people who didn't have that many options at all. So the structural discrimination from society as a whole meant that these individuals were starved of choices. So I don't think we owe the society anything by taking up a job that was handed out to them as a piecemeal contribution. No. The last thing I think is that they were just unresponsive to a whole bunch of things that Lucas argued when he told you that it was important for these kinds of communities to be uplifted. Because at the end of the day, if you recognize the harms that will end up, that these minority students are going to end up facing as a result of being from that same position yourself, then we think that the issue here is that you are going to be held responsible for the fact that you didn't do anything at a point in which you could have, and you are therefore complicit in the outcome that the student is in. If you recognize that society is blind to the discrimination, then you become complicit in the fact that the student ends up dropping out of school and ends up doing a lot worse. What then was the pathway to success they talked about? Recognize that a lot of the things that they were talking about are not mutually exclusive. So fighting for affirmative action scholarships, for example, are not mutually exclusive. Neither is, for instance, having more teachers or minority teachers end up in the workforce. I will spend a lot of time talking about why you're unlikely to end up being fired, but I'm going to deal with that later in the worst case scenario that they do. Why is it the comparing is still better on our side of the house? The main attack coming from them about this, the main harm coming from them was that you hide the incompetencies of students. But I don't think that's necessarily the case, because I think the first thing that we need to note is that even if it was true that your grades, you may not have completely deserved the grades, I think that the problem here is that we need to recognize that oftentimes things that you learn in school are not ultimately determinative of your ability to go out and get a job in the future. The problem is that the disproportionate signal that grades send to future job seekers, for example, is something that these students are not able to get around. So for example, a university degree is meant to signal your commitment to your work and your ability to show up on time and other skills that individual has. The issue is that university degree does not take into account, or the grades do not take into account, the nuances of an individual's contextual position that makes it more difficult for them to get the grades. Employers only see what the university degree says, but not what the student had to go through in order to get that degree. And so we think that it's okay even if you don't know everything in that particular field, because at the end of the day, your ability to be a good worker has to do with your ability to overcome some difficulties. To the extent to which we recognize that we're helping that group of people who are somewhere on the margins the most, then we think that those are the individuals who will be able to succeed in the future. Yeah.
As a minority in a unique position to point criticism at the authority that the marking system is not fair, aren't you hiding that flaw by yourself being complicit in the grading system, which now seems to be fair, but it actually isn't?
So if you take the characterization that, okay, so I'm going to deal with this on the two characterizations first. In the situations in which this will make all the difference, the inflation of the grades that you're talking about for the student in terms of getting them into the university or helping them promote another level in the school, stopping them from backing out, then I think that those particular outcomes to the individual, given that you can't guarantee the outcome of being able to convince an entire educational system that is determined by like white old men high up in the ministry, for example, is a solid benefit that the teacher ought to take because it's much more likely to succeed than otherwise. In the situations in which this may not necessarily be determinative in the child's future, we told you a bunch of benefits with regards to the way that inspires students. So it oftentimes is a knock-on effect to the extent to which this may not necessarily be something that like changes your entire life by the grade itself, but rather inspires a student to stay in school and be able to work harder. The next thing they told us is that this creates resentment among students who are actually competitive. But I don't understand why it's the case. Firstly, majorities are oftentimes not affected by the minorities anyway, simply because they are quantitatively less in numbers. But also secondly, I think a lot of the problems of social isolation that these people face is because it was the stereotype that it is not worth being friends with these individuals because they don't do well in their studies and they are bad influences on you. To the extent to which these individuals show that they can get a good grade, I think it's more likely to increase the interaction with the majority students rather than decrease it. But in the worst case scenario, the teacher does get found out and gets fired. I think that the impact is very, very marginal. The first reason why is because I think that any sort of show of support that a minority teacher has towards a minority community, if your characterization is true, will ultimately be seen as that teacher favoring the student anyway. So to the extent to which that is true, then the outcomes and backlash you're talking about will still happen. The teacher might as well do more. But in the comparative of the two scenarios, we think that right now, we think that the value in the community that you have when you're just acting as a normal teacher is very, very slight. So what we wanted to do on our side of the house was to ensure that, what did I just say here? Oh, crap. Right, so these teachers are seen as exceptions and not norms. So we think that what's important that we need to do for these students is to be able to create at least some sort of like guaranteed benefit that these students are able to have. The personal cost to the teacher in the grand scheme of things is a lot less than otherwise, because even if you have fewer minority teachers in the school, like if these teachers do nothing for the minority communities anyway, they'll just remain that few minority teachers and they don't actually create impact on the wider community as a result of what they have done. So we think that even in the worst case, we win the comparative happy.
Okay, thank you very much. I now invite you all to
Let's first break the deadlock of how do teachers actually get caught and what are the impacts of this. Realize that we do realize to a certain extent that maybe authorities may not be able to catch it, although that's still plausible under our ground. But they mention that teachers' pets and people who are opposite to the teachers getting a good grade is a thing, which means that in general, in classroom conversations, you do point out at that person, saying that that person is a teacher's pet and that person got an unfair grade. And that is how usually class people in the classrooms have a resentment towards that particular person. Imagine that a particular community or an underprivileged community, and then you look at that community and see that that particular community is getting an inflated grade. Why does that happen in the first place? Understand this. If that person is unfairly treated in any other course, means that that person is probably getting a C+ instead of a B. Means that this teacher, if fairly treated, would have given him a B. But now it seems that he's actually inflating the grade, means that he's probably giving him a B+ or an A. That jump is something that is very, very noticeable that you find out, because that is what happens to inflation. If that person in general is already getting bad grades, that is the sort of jump that is very, very noticeable underground, something that we have already said. And when you notice that, as a majority community, you notice that one particular community is indeed looking like they are indeed getting unfavorable benefits from that, means that you are likely to get resentment. What does that happen in general? So according to them, getting fired is a bad thing. But here the worst harm is not getting fired. The worst harm is that your classrooms were supposed to cooperate with you in other courses, were supposed to be cooperating with you in terms of getting the group studying and others, making your university or school life better for you, which is very, very important for a minority to have allies, because in general, according to their characterization, they face toxic realities of life and they probably need a favorable environment more than any other person to succeed. Means that for them that environment is much more crucial than any other person. When you do not get that environment, the likelihood that your performance will drop later on it increases so forth, which means that this resentment building, if there's any small possibility of it, this will affect the minority much more than any other, it affects any other student, because in general the environment is supposed to be hostile. If you make it more hostile, it just exaggerates all the harms that you get. But more importantly, I already talked about how positions in power, when assumed by people of minority groups, are scrutinized more, even from levels of authority, because levels of authority are structural place positions held by the majority. At that particular point in time, if there are enough complaints, there was a scenario that way. If there are enough complaints, then that teacher either may get fired or may get blocked from crucial promotion that would enable that teacher to bring about and question the sort of structural problems that they in general face. Which means that in conclusion, getting caught by authorities may be less likely, but the resentment is absolutely something that is going to happen, and that resentment has much more harms than any benefit that they can show under their ground, because that resentment is built up to the fact that these individuals do not get the sort of environment they require to succeed. And under their worst case, the teacher gets fired, all of her benefits go down, that school probably does not have a minority teacher anymore, and all the conversations shut down, and everything becomes worse. In conclusion, we win this. Secondly, how do you help the minorities under our world versus under their world? Understand this. If you are minority students, and they did say that we're not going to tell the minority students that we're inflating their grades. What does this mean? This means that if you're a minority student, you know that you have been unfairly treated all of your life. If you go up to that minority teacher, you're expecting the grade that you think assesses your level. What does this mean? This means that if I'm a B grade student, I expect a B from that minority teacher because that minority teacher is being fair. Grades tell me what my incompetencies are, how much I need to improve further, and how much effort I need to put in. The point at which I get an inflated grade, my sense of self-worth is tied to that particular I'm probably a B plus or an A student, but you're never giving me grades that are better than. So the subtle sorts of discrimination that you needed to fight through hard work, you never go for them because that teacher is unable to show you your flaws. In comparison, if that teacher was fair in giving you a better grade, that teacher would have said, okay, you gotta be, these are the reasons you gotta be, and these are the things that you need to improve on, rather than which is something that's really, really hard when you're giving that person a good grade, because good grade entails the fact that you have less work to do, is that you're unable to point out the flaws that that person is able to face. Why is this so important? Under the world, they tell you that one grade will enable these people to get that job. The problem with this is that, as we have already pointed out, when you go out there for a job interview or anything of that sort, you're much better equipped to fight that if you already know of your incompetencies, if you know of the fact that how you can tackle these problems. If you know that the real life problems are such and your own incompetencies are such, you're much better equipped to fight that job interview. You're much better equipped to know that what your weaknesses are worth and make yourself more employable, rather than having an inflated sense of self-worth and rather than having an inflated grade on your certificate, which actually, according to them, actually does count for nothing, right? So at that particular point in time, you do not get the benefits, but the harms are still there, that you're stuck in a bubble of thinking that you're a very good student, whereas you're not. Yeah.
So in current status quo, these minority students already face situations that are hostile towards them, they see them incompetent and bad at their studies. Why would an individual teacher who, like you say, is quantitatively outnumbered by everyone else, be able to make structural changes rather than helping a person to know they can help?
Very simple. If I'm fair to a minority teacher, I will give you a B. I can explain to the whole class why I give that minority child a B, and he is getting like C plus in other grades. Becomes easier for me to explain because I did not inflate his grade, but I can rather fairly describe to people why this person is probably a B grade student. What does this mean? This means that as a minority teacher, you can start classroom conversations about unfair grades, where students themselves can mobilize and protest against, where it's easy to convince people of the majority that look, this is a fair grading system versus your unfair grading system. The point at which you're inflating, and it's obvious that you're inflating, that conversation gets swept away, and you never get into that particular conversation as to explain to them what fairness of grading system is and how fair grading systems work, because you yourself have not been fair, and something that has been repeatedly pointed out to you. On morality, they say that teaching profession does not have any sort of morality attached to it. We tell you that as a teacher, you should be able to serve all of the children, all of the students that exist in your classroom fairly, but more importantly, the principle of not jeopardizing any minority student, because there can be resentment towards that student, in and of itself is a principle that we've been defending throughout the line, right? Because since the probability of that resentment is so high, means that any risk that you yourself put on your community is something that goes against their principle of protecting their community. Because in general, you're not protecting the community anymore, you're putting your community at risk, and we tell you it's a very big harm we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much.
So I think that if the role of this community teacher is to serve his or her own community, it's best served where in a world in which the community student gets access to the right kinds of guidance, the right kinds of information that will help him better in life. So the team that proves that these minority students are better served in principle and in the long run are winning this debate. So firstly, we told you, in principle, it's a disservice and attained to his teacher's own legacy and his ability to create service to the community at large, which was like disengaged by just random analogies of like armies and how they're different, but one in which this person has his own legacy of opting into a different way of life, which is hard work, which this person sacrifices. But we gave you far more analysis in terms of like the responsibility of this serviceman to his own community. We told you that the responsibility does not extend to like guaranteeing them a job by engaging on the idea of first that this doesn't guarantee them a job in most cases by showing disincentivizing them from working hard, fixing their ways in which they could improve themselves, making them more competent and more capable of taking a job. But secondly, putting them in a false reality where they expected fairness, but an inflated grade is what they get and what they assume to be fair, where they blame the rest of society for everything else that's happening to them, and they blame the shortcomings they have, not on themselves, which they don't improve on, but on external factors. On all of those things, in like the general principle behind this is that the teacher had a service to this child in terms of improving his life as a moral support, which he or she failed in principle and in the long run, because you don't guarantee this child a better life. You guarantee him a false reality where he assumes he has a better life, where even if like they win the debate on how this is fair to the child because of all the oppression he faces, as long as it doesn't make his life better, we still win that debate. But there was also a deadlock that we broke throughout. They tried to like sugarcoat it by saying like, look, this grade isn't going to increase that much, so no one will figure it out. It's unlikely we're going to fire a teacher from all teachers under far more scrutiny than any other teacher ever. Second, by telling you that in most cases it's evident. Like the fact that if the government knows about teachers' pets, it means everyone knows about teachers' pets and what a teacher does to a teacher's pet. And we've continuously shown that even if it doesn't reach the top of the pyramid, the general attitude of the class is going to be one that knows exactly what's happening. So a mobilized child like community which could have formed meaningful interactions is transverse into a community that is hostile, competitive, and disregarding of this individual that's vulnerable. We gave you severe harms of this, where we talked about how like standing up for the child, making meaningful connections for him, helping him get the job that he needs in the long run, are all things that will go away, and the only responses that the government side gave to us are, look, people will find out in general. So, worst case scenario, and they're somewhat conceded to it, people do find out, all of these harms still exist, they never engage with these harms, we still win that. But most of all, we think the pathway to development for individuals within this community is destroyed, something they never engage with. When there are people that will succeed no matter what the biases are, they will come out on top. They will form leadership roles within that community and eventually go back into helping that community and act as role models and beacons of legacies that can't be tainted. I told you this in my first, and we carried it down from our second and third speeches, never engage to. Why is this the most important argument in this debate? It's important because this is a beacon of light that first normalizes this community, makes them normal, makes them accepted, and shows they're just as competent. If you can't prove competence from God, guaranteeing them a job doesn't solve anything. We solve the issues, we talk about them, and we make them more meaningful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The awesome
Such it. Okay. I got my first 81 in Asians when I was 14. I didn't deserve it because my coach was probably trying to tell my seniors that they sucked and they needed to work harder. But I remember at 81, I started attending training. I tried out for the team because I thought maybe I can be good at something in school. I'm still here at 30 trying to win Asians. My coach won't remember me. He has many other hundreds of kids he's coached and he's now a successful lawyer. But I remember him. And I remember the hope that filled my heart when a young kid was good enough to stand toe-to-toe with his senior team. Never underestimate the power of hope for children. When I talk about whether these people will be found out one day, they talk about scrutiny, which already happens in the status quo. They said the jump is too obvious, but we give you a lot of reasons I want to remind you about, which are never once touched. We told you that we'll spread it out between many races, so you can't tell which race is being favored. We told you that public schools in DPM are poor, they can't really check this thing properly. We told you about subjects like English with subjective marking bands, where this kind of subjectivity is plausible to begin with, and we also pointed out that you won't anyhow fire black teachers because that's just really bad PR for the schools. Nothing touched on that side. We even gave you worst case, that if you're found out and you're sacked, those 2 classes, those 2 years of people you taught and pushed through the system are going to be your lights in the world, those people getting the 81s and making the world a better place. Let me now talk briefly about competing responsibilities. And what we pointed out is that responsibilities are contextual. Just as we do not jail people who steal out of hunger, principles are often informed by the context you are in. And Shirley, Adil and I told you that context is very unfair. At the point where you value integrity as an a priori good, it makes you complicit by perpetuating a system of worse outcomes where people drop out. You as a minority of all people should know how this happens. You are perpetuating a system where white leaders tell black kids in their school, I can't pronounce Osa and I don't want to learn your last name, so I give you childish nicknames. At that point where you value integrity for some highfalutin purpose, you've lost the sight of greater human importance. And then they gave us some pseudo-lit material in the dialogue POI, where they said you shouldn't be tampering with the marks so that your criticism of the system will become a lot more potent. Shirley was awesome because she reacted this on the spot and told us that you're just one teacher. You can't do much against a system full of fat white men and administrators where the powers that be are arrayed against you. In the best case, it is not mutually exclusive, but in the worst case, we think you do what you can to get more students into power. Which leads me to the last area of clash. Who does the best service to the child? And when they tell us that the duty is to tell the kid that she's incompetent, that she can't make it, the thing is you tell a girl the same messages that she gets at home day after day, that she isn't quite there yet in the English, she's going to think and confirm that she sucks. We're going to shout out to all those small institutions that would not have broken if not for the cat, who will now stop trying to do their best because it never once dealt with an argument on human psychology and the placebo effect, despite it coming out all the way in PM. Because education, Mr. Speaker, is not concerned about the you today, but who you can be tomorrow. Deal with arguments that can give them all the counseling you want, but that is at best not mutually exclusive. But the role models that best case depends on are those privileged people who can make it big and come back and contribute. These people are few. Only side government gives you a unique method that allows you to fight the majority of minority students, allow them to signal their worth, as Shirley said, and get their foot in the door. So in response to the argument that the op will say there's resentment when people hate the minority, they already do that because the white students do not talk to the black and the back of the class who comes half the time. The way to solve this, again, never dealt with in PM, is to normalize that more black people will be in society. More hijabis can be in the USA, between supervisors and natives. They will own a small business on the corner, become entrepreneurs. We see more familiar faces, a familiar ebony skin among the crowd that makes these minorities want to stay home. It is that power and that government gives you a roadmap to how we chip away at the long-run problem, a solvency that IBA-DU never gave you. We told you that remember that we are surrounded by darkness. When your students' drives are slowing, it only takes a spark to get a fire going.
Thank you very much.